Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Miriam Gray and I'm joining you live in the World Bank Group headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to everyone here in the audience and those around the world joining us online. The first half of 2022 has witnessed one of the largest shocks of global food and energy markets that the world had seen in decades. As countries rebounded from COVID pandemic, supply chains struggled to keep up with increasing demand for food and energy and put pressures on prices. The war in Ukraine intensified the record high food and energy prices and triggered global crisis that will drive millions more into extreme poverty, magnifying hunger and malnutrition. Food and energy crises are particularly devastating for the poorest and most vulnerable people. Despite the recent stabilization of agriculture prices and resumption of grain export from the Black Sea, high food inflation, energy and food security remain a critical concern. In the face of these challenges, leaders from around the world are meeting here to discuss these impacts and how to shape solutions that can bring stronger, safer and more prosperous communities. Today, we will be looking at how to build resilience to overlapping crises with a comprehensive and coordinated effort to align incentives, accelerate innovation, and scale up investments. And you can follow this event in several languages. We are streaming in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic at live.worldbank.org and also on our social media channels. Let's take a look at what's coming up over the next hour. You can see we have many interesting discussions coming up, and to start, the president of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, has invited two guests, Her Excellency Annette Werenheim, Minister for International Development of Norway, and Mustafa Terab, Chairman and CEO of OCP Group, a leading global fertilizer provider, to discuss how policy measures and incentives could help address the impacts of compounding energy and food crises. Over to you, David.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thank you both for joining. And our goal is to have a conversation about food and fertilizer and energy, and we recognize the world is in a difficult place on all three right now. World Bank has puts out a lot of diagnostics or data on the situation of world food markets, fertilizer markets, and we've been having other events during the day today. So I want to turn straight into the conversation with you. And you, as Norway is very involved in this in multiple ways. You've experienced a drought this year, which reduces your electricity production. Your energy production is more valuable. And you also, I know you personally think a lot about how food can be produced in developing countries. So could you update us on the energy situation, maybe in Norway, but also in Europe as a whole? How are you thinking about it, and what are the changes going on?
Well, you know, all countries need to enter into an energy transformation. Of course, the big worry now is that the current situation will inhabit that transition. And I'm particularly concerned about developing countries, whether they will be able to, you know, both reach the affordability and the availability of energy consumption that they need, but in a sustainable way. So I have decided to believe that this crisis will be an opportunity both for Europe, for the Western world, and for developing countries to fast-track that energy transformation. Will that work out in practice? Well, that depends on certain things. First of all, access to finance. especially in developing countries. And we see the tendency that investors are becoming more risk adverse. We know that the fiscal space for many countries is limited. The transition pace may slow down, so the jury's still out, but I have decided to be an optimist, and there are things that we could do. Now, in terms of the developing world, for example, as a Minister of International Development, I control the ODA. We can use the ODA a lot smarter in order to unlock private capital by ensuring guarantee schemes. MIGA is in the World Bank is a great example of that, thinking out of the box. We have recently established a climate investment fund in Norway, 10 billion Norwegian crowns for de-risking private capital. So basically, I think there's a lot of hope to speed up the transition, given that we are able to unlock that private capital, and we can do a lot more to do that with ODA money.
We talked about this summit when I met in Copenhagen with you and colleagues. And so as we think about de-risking, one of the challenges that we grapple with, and I know you do, is how do you measure the risk of projects, and how do you share the burden of the de-risking costs? So you work with the Norwegian private sector in their investments abroad. How do you think about the risk profile of those companies?
Well, that's always a balance. Of course, we don't only work with Norwegian private business.
Okay.
Any
So
private capital is welcome.
Your 10 billion krona fund is primarily to de-risk for European companies, or
any companies, any private capital willing to go into projects where we can change fossil energy production based on fossil fuel with renewable sources is eligible. And what we see is that there is a lot of interest, maybe a little bit risk adversity now. And so I need to find that balance where we risk enough with our ODA money, but at the same time attracting the private capital. Yeah. And that will vary, of course, from country to country.
And we work hard on that to catalyze. So what is it that we're doing that allows or increases the amount of investment that goes in? I don't know, Mustafa, you may be this may be a client for you. Tell us about your business. We met in Morocco and had a very interesting conversation that I know you are very involved in Morocco, but throughout Africa. So just go through some of the dynamics that are going on right now. Fertilizer is in short supply. We've had meeting after meeting. I met in New York 2 weeks ago with President Macron and a big group to talk about specific fertilizer bottlenecks. Give us some color and context for that problem.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I really believe in this case the putting things in context is very important, because there is a visible crisis today, a shortfall of fertilizer, but we should recognize that what's visible today has been revealed by a crisis, but it's based on a long-term situation that we have to address. And the long-term situation is a great imbalance between production of fertilizer and what the world needs in terms of fertilizer. Put things again in perspective, 1/2 of food production today is due to the use of fertilizers, of mineral fertilizers. So it is really critical that we have availability of those fertilizers. And if you recall, prices of fertilizers started increasing before the war, before the present war. 2 or 3 years ago already we saw this imbalance between supply and demand impact heavily prices. So, you know, if there is an opportunity in the crisis, as the minister suggested, it is really to address not only the short-term imbalance, and indeed the critical continent is Africa, because this is where the shortfall is tremendous and immediate impact could be the worst. We're, as an African producer of fertilizer, doing our part in making next year available 4 million tons of fertilizer for the African farmer at the right price, because we're also customizing fertilizer for the food and the soil, for the plant and the soil in Africa.
Tell us a little basics about your business. So in Morocco, there's phosphate, but you need natural gas. In other parts of Africa, so you're both a producer of fertilizer and a distributor. Tell us some about it.
Yes, I mean, fertilizers basically are made of two nutrients, three, but two main nutrients, which is nitrogen made out of natural gas and phosphate. Morocco has the largest reserves of phosphate, but doesn't have natural gas. So we import the nitrogen fertilizer that we blend with the phosphate part to make the compound fertilizer. And what I was mentioning, the customization means not doing a one-size-fits-all type of fertilizer, but customizing and adapting the fertilizer to the conditions of the soil and the plant. The advantage there is that we not only reduce environmental degradation, because we make sure that the plant, that the quantity of nutrients we put is fully absorbed by the plant and the soil, but not surprisingly, those fertilizers that have even more impact in terms of productivity are sometimes half the price of the standard fertilizer. So the 4 million tons I mentioned for Africa, which, to put in perspective, Africa consumes today 5 million tons of phosphate-based fertilizer. So 4 million tons is about 80% of the demand. These are, we can provide at cheaper prices because it's customized fertilizer. Mm-hmm. In a way, Africa is innovating before other continents in this respect.
Yes, but this is a global phenomenon. Better use of fertilizer is a critical factor in climate, in environmental issues, and it's one that's been difficult for countries to do. The World Bank's been very involved in that in China and India, of having more efficient use of fertilizer and more appropriate use. But you would say you're cutting edge in Africa by tailoring the fertilizer to the soil and the crops that are being needed.
Absolutely, it is in a way, innovating and using high tech to do this. It's satellite imagery first to know what the content of the soil in terms of nutrient is in real time, and then formulating the fertilizer that addresses that particular information.
I'll come back to Anne. And thoughts on food in particular, and how do we get more food in Africa? Obviously, fertilizer is part of it, but also the financing that you mentioned.
Wonderful.
Thoughts?
And if I may just quickly revert to your question, because I didn't really touch much upon Europe, but this is a good bridge from explaining this perfect storm that's hitting the world. As you mentioned, in Norway, we've been facing not a drought, but we rely on hydroelectric power in Norway, and we have water reservoirs that are really below the minimal level. At the same time, we export gas to Europe as much as we can due to the current situation. Gas in Europe is traditionally used a lot for producing energy. Obviously, with those prices, we end up exporting hydroelectric power instead from Norway. So it really is, a combined, really difficult situation. And then, with the gas prices, we see, for example, Yara, which is a big Norwegian-based fertilizer producer, has shut down several factories in Europe because it's simply not enough. It's simply not possible to push that extra cost to the customer. Now, what is deeply disturbing, and what this week we will discuss this week, is that at the moment we are facing a food price crisis that can be fixed with money, with logistics. However, due to the fertilizer crisis, in one season we will not produce enough food in the world to feed everyone. Now that's an unprecedented situation. We have never seen it before.
That's over the 12 months starting now?
Well, it depends on the seasons around the world. I'm not an agronomist.
So in general, the world is at a food deficit, which is rare, or
In
maybe
a few months. Yes. I believe if we now go to Africa, which is possibly the continent most hardly hit, we must remember the small-scale producers. You know, some 80% of the food consumed in developing countries is produced by the smallest producers. Worldwide, 30 to 35% of the global food consumption comes from farms below 2 hectares. So we need to get fertilizers and improved seeds out there, and we need to prepare these farmers for new climates, a changing climate, with making sure that they get access to smart agronomy, climate-smart production methods, low-tech mechanization, and finance. And you know, we have the knowledge. We just need to get it out there. And I've decided to see this also as an opportunity. I come straight from Addis Ababa, where the African ministers of agriculture met to discuss this very topic. And you know, they say we are in a food crisis. At the same time, Africa is importing $56 billion worth of food from other continents every year, while at the same time they have 65% of the world's left arable land. So, you know, this is also an opportunity to make Africa the breadbasket that they should be.
One follow-on. So Yara, you mentioned Yara not producing in Europe. So then where is Europe getting its fertilizer?
Well, even Norwegian farmers are finding it hard to actually invest putting the grains into the soil, because it simply it's not worth the while. But of course there is still fertilizer out there, but it's very, very expensive.
So Mustafa, is there a connection to Europe? Do you feel the change in the European fertilizer situation in your businesses? So if Europe's not producing fertilizer and not planning to plant as many crops, does that ring true? And how is it affecting Africa?
Well, it impacts Africa because Africa is still importing about half the fertilizer it's using. And keep in mind that the need for Africa, which consumes, say, from 5 to 10 million tons, actually it's 30 million tons if we want to address the global food security challenge that the Honorable Minister mentioned. We have to change our mindset about Africa, in a way. You know, we think of food security in Africa, Africa being the locus of where food insecurity is. But we have to think long terms. Given the figures, you know, 60% of arable land unused in the world is in Africa. Yeah. That Africa is going to be a solution, or at least part of the solution for global
small farms. That means finance. That means choice of crops and choice of fertilizer, efficiency from that standpoint. I would add trade liberalization, trade facilitation, which the World Bank is trying to do, meaning one country may be able to make extra of a certain kind of food or fertilizer, and trading that with neighbors is a really important part of the efficiency process, if that can work out. And you know, we have a big at World Bank water practice, because water is when Mustafa you said fertilizer is 40. You had 45% of the input to crops with.
It's actually half the food production.
Half of food production
is attributed to the use of fertilizer.
And then another part would be the seeds, another part would be the water, and so on down, the tractors and the mechanization that might be needed. And so fertilizer is the biggest component, would you think? It must
well,
be.
it is, but it's not enough. I mean, when I mentioned we have to rethink what the green revolution in Africa has to be. It cannot look like other green revolutions. It has to be small landholder focused, but even the way we produce fertilizer and use them has to be very different from other green revolutions. And I would just want to add that you cannot customize fertilizer if you're simply importing them. So investing in fertilizer production in Africa is also going to be part of the solution.
And making the rich, back to my first comment, renewable energy, making sure that rural areas, food production areas, get access to small-scale renewable energy, because we also know that there's a huge food loss due to lacking infrastructure, lacking cool chains, etc. And you know, the technologies out there, it's becoming so cheap, solar power, wind power, and it can easily be scaled up for access for small-scale farmers around Africa.
Exactly right. So background on World Bank programs, as you know, we have a big effort on direct aid now, given the crisis. So a $30 billion allocation for food that goes to food systems, which goes heavily into less waste, but also more rationalization of the food systems. And so that work, we've done a sizable program in East Africa where they're facing real famine or drastic food shortages, and as well as in several other parts of Africa, and that's ongoing as the shortages become apparent. I'm really concerned by, Anne, what you were saying about the your projections are 1 year forward, that there's less food. Well, let me observe, there is sizable amounts of food in storage in some countries.
True.
So to bridge that gap,
True.
one thing will be more production and doing it sooner rather than later, and another will be drawing on stored food. China is one of the big storers. There's also heavy storage in India, in the US, and other that can help bridge some of that gap in over the next year. I know they're trying to flag us here.
Thank you, David and his guest, for this conversation. But before you go, we actually have audience questions we've received. Our audience has been posting questions online and throughout this broadcast. Mateus Miranda from Portugal sent us this video.
How is Norway, for example, supporting climate-resilient food systems? Where is the main focus?
Let me repeat the question. Madam Minister, this would be for you. How is Norway supporting climate-resilient food systems, and what is the main focus?
That's a great question, and it relates to agriculture all over the world. All farmers have to adapt to a new climate, but we know that it's most urgent for small-scale farmers, self-subsistence farmers that have no security net whatsoever. So what we are doing is, for example, through several years, we have supported the GAFS, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, through the World Bank. FAO has some interesting work on climate action in agriculture, and it's really all about changing agronomy, agricultural practices. It is about research into, for example, seed varieties, more heat-tolerant seeds for wheats, rice varieties that can tolerate more salinity, etc. Some great work's being done. As I mentioned, low-tech mechanization, in order to not disturb the soil so much so that it doesn't lose so much humidity. And as I also mentioned, getting access to renewable energy so that you get less food waste, less food loss.
That's a strong list. I'm glad you mentioned GAFSP. So that's part of our information systems at the bank and our program systems. And I was happy the U.S. The U.S. this morning confirmed their direct contribution to GAFSP. So it's a program that has wide acceptance and support.
We have one more question from the audience, if that's okay. Let's just listen. The next one actually is coming from Brazil, Rafael Nagueira.
How can we bring innovation that can revolutionize the fertilizer sector?
Yeah. Mustafa, can I add to that? How can we innovate and revolutionize? And can you mention ammonia in that?
Sure. Look, I mentioned we need a rethink of how fertilizers are produced and are used in a sense, what the fertilizer industry has called the 4 R's. Making sure we use the right fertilizer at the right time for the right soil at the right rate, which means, in a way, customizing at the local level. So best practices are going to become very local, and that's good news for this small landholder. How do we do that? Is daring to innovate. And technology is global, but innovation is always local. And the good news is it has already happened, for example, in Africa. We don't think about it, but 20 years ago, there's already been an African revolution that didn't take the path of other revolutions, which is the telecom one. And Africa dared to go mobile from the outset. I see former colleagues here that were part of it. The World Bank and IFC were a big part of that revolution in Africa. And if you think about it, it was courageous at the time. It was deciding that African countries would not use the same path of development of the telecom sector as other countries. Namely, no need to increase landline density, let's go mobile from the outset. And a lot of innovation came out of that. Mobile payment didn't start with Apple Pay, but with M-Pesa in Kenya, etc.
And what's the leapfrog on fertilizer? The idea of it being precisely tailored to the needs?
The technology is here. It's just daring to do it. So it takes investors and IFC to de-risk that, but also government policies that enable that innovation.
Yeah.
And that's where the World Bank can be very
I think this is huge. As you're saying, there was a green revolution that was so important in India and in feeding the world decades ago. But as we look at it now, combining digital capabilities and even satellite capabilities and making more granular the map for fertilizer can have huge efficiency gains.
And it's already proven in many countries.
Yes.
Ethiopia and other places, we've done it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David and his guests. Thank you for those answers. To the audience in the room and online, please continue to post your questions at live.worldbank.org. Meanwhile, we have several experts standing by to answer those questions in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic, and they are replying to as many as possible. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and use hashtag #FoodFuelForAll to share your thoughts and that discussion and for those to come. We are also inviting you to take a part in a special poll. The question we are asking today is, which of these you think contributed most to the global food and energy shocks? Is it A, supply chain issues, B, the war in Ukraine, C, extreme weather events, D, exchange rate volatility, or E, all of the above? You can cast your vote now at live.worldbank.org, and we'll bring you results at the end of this event. With those issues in mind, let's take a look at how shortages of food and fuel are affecting day-to-day existence of communities whose lives already been severely impacted by recent events.
Bado tuko na mifugo zinaangamia kwa kiangazi. Sasa hiyo challenge mingi tunapitia. Hata ng'ombe sasa zinakufa. Hata na bado watu wanapata kitu kama siku 2 ama 3 kama wa chakula.
Mambo ya stima, Kitambo ulikuwa unalipa ukiweka kama 200 vya token, unaona umekupeleka almost a month. Kwa saa hii pia stima zimeenda juu. Ukiweka 50 bob ni hiyo siku, kesho yake inaanza kuitisha kulialia.
Rĩu ithuĩ ona maita maingĩ tũrahũthĩra kando kuona nyũmba no na nĩ kũgĩte na thĩna cases nyingĩ mũno tondũ mĩaki nĩ ĩragwata mũno rĩu gũkũ manyũmba-inĩ.
Mtoto hawezi akasoma vizuri maanake hakuna pesa na stima imeenda juu.
Lakini kwa saa hii imeafektiwa kabisa kwa sababu venye tunanunua sio hivyo venye tulikuwa tunanunua mbeleni. Kwa sababu sasa imepanda bei kwa sababu ya transport. Haya kuuza huyu customer mwenye unauzia
Une heure de coupure dans notre secteur d'activité, c'est réellement catastrophique. Notre spécialité, c'est les produits frais. Pas d'électricité, c'est donc un produit qui est mal conservé et cela occasionne d'énormes pertes.
Pues mi familia. El programa nos ha apoyado más que todo con conocimientos técnicos y con la facilidad al adquirir algunos productos.
Para la compra de insumos, tanto fertilizantes, insecticidas, herbicidas, todo, para manejar el cultivo de la mejor forma para hacer productivo ese rubro en el momento adecuado.
La mayor parte de los comunarios nos dedicamos a la producción, ya que sembrábamos maíz, yuca, frijol, pero con este tema de la sequía se nos fue la producción abajo. Que todo a mí me emociona porque yo la verdad nunca sembré papa, es la primera vez que he sembrado y veo de que es un fruto muy bueno. Juicio, eso muchas veces nos ha tocado hasta estar sin luz más que todo por el tema económico, ¿no? De que no hay. Pero yo creo que ahora con esta función de riego que nosotros tenemos ya no vamos a llegar a eso. Vamos a producir con más ganas y le vamos a echar más ganas, ¿no?
Hi, I'm Neda Amin in Khartoum, Sudan, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
I'm joined here by our panel guests, but before we introduce them, I would like to look at the latest data which underscores the importance of the discussion we've been having today. Let's take a look at the screen now and see how the prices of essential commodities changed as a result of the shocks we've been discussing. Let's start with the cost of energy, which includes coal, oil, gas prices, comparing January to September 2021 with the same period in 2022. There's been a dramatic 76% increase in the cost of energy. What about food prices? We know that overlapping global crises have affected the supply of essential staples. Taking those same periods again in 2022 and 2021, the cost of food went up by 21%. And lastly, let's take a look at the price of fertilizer. This is vital for boosting agricultural productivity. Here we've seen the largest global increase of all, a shocking 97% rise in just a year. Now to speak more about this and discussion specific solutions on how to transition to clean energy and resilient food system that are vital to protect people and the planet, let me introduce our guest in studio today. Let's welcome Axel van Trossenburg, World Bank Group Managing Director of Operations. His Excellency Sida Keita, Minister of Finance from Gambia. Jo Swinen, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Arania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation of Egypt. Let's just go straight into it. It's a lot of ground to cover. Axel, my first question is to you. We've been discussing obviously a lot today, but let's just talk about the role of the bank, the World Bank, that we are playing, and what are we doing to respond to food and energy shocks?
Well, first of all, I think these shocks are coming now on top of a world that is in a state of shock, because we have been barely coming out of the COVID crisis. Then you have the war in Ukraine and the enormous fallout. So countries have a real hard time, because this multitude of crises is cumulative and having therefore such a great impact on this. What the World Bank has been doing is particularly, what I will say is, the times are difficult, but we are determined in action. In action is that you need to act on this very quickly to provide the necessary support. And what does that mean? In the agricultural sector, it cannot only be, unquote, band-aid, that you just give the money and then hope for the best. What you will need to say is, can we provide packages that help to alleviate the short term, particularly in the food security area, but at the same time also work much more on the resilience agenda. How can countries becoming more resilient against future crises? And that is a comprehensive. That can be on storage facilities, can be also in the agriculture. It is the whole value chain that needs to be considered. And that is where we then are providing support. And what you are seeing is we're providing individual country support, or secondly, also regional support, because some of the challenges are similar in the region. So for example, in the Africa region, we are providing their sub-regional programs that are dealing with food security challenges. What is also more is that the countries need a lot of resources, and therefore what we have said in this context, we need to give an indication that the bank stands ready to do whatever it takes to provide financial support. So we have announced that we could put a financial package on the table up to $30 billion. How does that consist? Of new operations up to $12 billion and $18 billion of existing operations that we can partly restructure and also adjust to the needs of the day. And we have started the implementation. As we speak, we have committed over $6 billion. That is good, but basically what it is, the World Bank is only one part of an ecosystem of support. So we see ourselves as part of a coalition that can be on the bilateral side and multilateral side. So we are working with also multilateral organizations, particularly of the UN system, be it at the FAO, be it particularly those are very action-oriented, like the World Food Programme or UNICEF, to provide that support. So I think what we can do, we can mitigate this, but I think a lot more needs to be done. I think these annual meetings are good for one person. It is, again, attracting attention, putting the finger that we need to act on it. We cannot leave countries behind because of this crisis. And we need to be aware that if we don't act, we are seeing an increase in poverty, which we unfortunately, if you are looking at the latest poverty report, sees that extreme poverty is increasing by, as we have estimated, by 70 million. And if we don't act, it will get worse. So it is now the time to act, and we need to do it immediately.
Thank you. Thank you, Axel. My next question is for Minister Keita. Minister, as Axel just said, actually, Gambia is also working a lot with the bank, and there are lots of, actually several, innovative energy projects. Can you tell us how these are helping to mitigate energy price spikes and strengthen both food and energy security for Gambian people? And what are the measures that are taken by the government to aid the energy sector against the rising fuel prices?
Thank you very much. Gambia is a net energy importer. We import all our energy needs, and the spike in the price of energy as well as food had left an untold challenge on both the government and the population of the Gambia. It has put a stress on our fragile economy, and with the intervention of the World Bank, we have been able to invest in a mix of energy that support the energy roadmap, which overall will consist of the alternative energy production. We also have the regional power supply from Senegal, as well as the existing hydrocarbon power production. That, on completion, will reduce the overall energy mix and the subsequent price reduction. The shock has not been very easy on the population and the government treasury for that matter. We were obliged to subsidize the price of fuel to the tune of $1.5 billion in the last 7 months, which translates to about $30 million to cushion the impact of the society. That notwithstanding, it left a big gap in our fiscal space, but we felt it was necessary as a government in order to ameliorate the shock or the pressure on the population. The other areas of interventions that we have done as a government is to partner with the World Bank to subsidize the cost of living of the most vulnerable segment through cash transfers. That came in very handy and supported the most vulnerable segment of society in the rural community. So these are some of the measures we have taken as a country. But overall, we can say that the intervention of partners like the World Bank has supported a large investment in the energy sector, which we believe upon completion, we will attain global energy sufficiency by 2035. That is the energy roadmap. It is a challenge. We are not out of the woods yet, and we still believe that we need to partner more with development partners in order to weather the storm. Thank you.
One follow-up question, Minister. We have received a question from the audience. Let's see. Recent events such as COVID and the war in Ukraine have shown just how vulnerable the global fuel supply chain could be. How can we enhance the resilience of the sector, especially in the face of growing disaster risk?
Yes, I think going forward, the only formula is resilience. And to build so, you need a multiple approach. One way is the trading system in the energy. As we know, energy is mainly traded through key producers, and they are operating as OPEC. And we need to have more supply side coming onto the market so as to increase the supply side in order to make sure that it's the fair market price that everybody is paying. Today, even if the supply and demand mechanism works such that the price should go down, we'll see production cuts from OPEC as is happening now. The other approach will be to increase this storage capacity. Small and developing countries like Gambia do not have enough storage capacity and cannot benefit from economies of scale of buying the product in large capacity, in large volumes when the prices are low. A third approach will be the use of financial markets, because as you know, oil is a traded commodities. The developing countries should be supported to develop the necessary financial tools to hedge against the rise of commodity oil prices. These three combinations, we believe, will adequately address and reposition developing countries to face the growing challenge of energy. And as I mentioned, the only way forward is resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. Your policy question for you. So, from your perspective, what are the key policy solutions that countries should be implementing now to address food security concern and build resilience to future shocks?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's, as several speakers have already emphasized, what we're dealing with is a systems question and a long run problem. I mean, food security has declined since 2015 already. the price spikes. We talked about the price shock in 2007, 2008, but since then we've had 2011, 12, now before Ukraine and after Ukraine. So the shocks are the new normality. So you need a system, a policy system that addresses that. That means you need a package of policies to address various aspects, but you also need short-term responses, medium-term and long-run. And so we don't have enough time to go through all of that, but let me emphasize maybe a few. I think in the short run, what we should be focused on is basically providing financial resources for humanitarian aid, clearly, but also domestically for targeted social protection programs. I think particularly paying attention to gender issues, because we know that women and children are most affected to that. Keeping trade open is really important. I mean, working with countries which have introduced export constraints, for example, and then also market intelligence is really important. Information that helps all the actors in the food chain to make the right decision, but also for governments to make the right policy choices. I think in the long run you can, again, many things, but maybe let me point out three. One is innovation, the other one is finance, and the third one is sustainable production and healthy consumption. Let me start with the last one. Okay, we really, for the future, to make our system, our transformation work, we cannot separate these things out anymore. Healthy diets and sustainable production have to go together. We have to come with a broad strategy on this. On the finance, I think we need a new food finance architecture that includes innovations in different parts of the world, private sector, public sector. One issue there is the repurposing agenda. We have $700 billion spent every year on agricultural subsidies. We have to rethink those, bring them more in line with healthy diets and sustainable production. And then the last point is on innovation. One is new innovations, but you know, there's so much technology that are available. People are just not using them, either because they don't have the incentive to use them, or because they cannot, they have problems with insurance, with access to capital. So all these things need to be addressed. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you. Rania, so the war in Ukraine has threatened food security across the world, and Egypt is unfortunately not an exception. So we work a lot with Egypt at the bank, and it'd be good to hear from you, what is the government working on to mitigate the impact and increase the agricultural resilience of Egypt?
Well, thank you very much, and just a few comments on Egypt. When we were here during the spring meetings, all the writings showed that there was a sense of panic around Egypt, being one of the biggest wheat importers, particularly from Ukraine and Russia. And we had to underscore that it's a shock, but not a panic. And this comes on the back of preemptive measures that the government took several years earlier. For example, investing in silos for wheat storage. That was not the case before 2014. Now we have it across different parts of the country, played an extremely important role in storing wheat. It wasn't in anticipation of the war, but that was became regular practice. The second was increasing agricultural land for wheat production. So actually half of what we consume is locally produced, creating incentives for farmers, trying to increase the yield. So again, some of the policies that Joe mentioned as well. Reform is a continuous process for any country. In our case, trying to look at the storage capacity, improve the yield, and widen the agricultural land for wheat production was extremely fundamental. When the shock happened, nonetheless, there had to be social safety nets for those mostly affected by the food increase, because wheat was one, but then you also had fuel, you had food, so the inflation impact was quite sizable, and this is where targeted policy comes in. And let me say that because we've already had programs and projects with the bank, such as ones related to social solidarity, making sure that the social safety nets are well targeted, digitized, that also helped tremendously in making these, the social safety net expansion much easier. That happened in COVID, and it also happened during the fallout of the crisis. The other important aspect, and let me just mention adaptation and resilience in light of Egypt being the president of COP coming up next month in Sharm el-Sheikh. And two key messages for us at COP, adaptation and resilience are extremely important, and the war has shown this, that we do need to increase the investments in agricultural projects and try and see crop resilient production. Something else is from pledges to implementation. Here comes the point on financing, and it's very important also that public money, whether it's from the MDBs or other sources, needs to try and leverage private sector investment in agriculture and water. And we're trying to provide examples of that because MDBs put together would only be able to fulfill 4% of total climate financing needs globally. And so to leverage on the private sector, there needs to be also a focus on innovative financing instruments. And that is another important message that we're bringing to COP as well.
Actually, let's pick up, I want to go back to the point you made. Let's talk about research and innovation. So in your capacity, what do you think what the role research can play in guiding the countries through the crisis response?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this because I work for a research organization, both IFPRI here in DC and or headquartered in DC, and the CGIAR more broadly. And so again, we have, I think the long-term strategy really has to focus on the resilience agenda, climate change, big time in there, but also on productivity, reduction of food loss and waste, etc. We have come up with a 7-action item crisis response, okay, where again, since the problems are, the solutions to the problem, I think, include some form of technology and innovation. Part is institutional change, and part is the policy agenda. And so our package of 7 is really addressing each of these things. For example, I think one of the things we really have to look into is fertilizer and soil fertility. Means part there's a policy issue, trade in fertilizer subsidies, etc. But part of it is also a technology issue, and not just on the fertilizer thing. I mean, there's a lot of potential room, we think, of using fertilizers more efficiently, but there is also a lot of room for improving other types of management practices so that we use less traditional fertilizers to use. Okay, so we have this 7-point. I don't think you want me to go through all the 7 points, but I'm more than happy to go into detail on it. Part of it is evidence-based policy in crisis frameworks, etc. And for example, the AMIS, which is part of developed in the G20, it's the Agricultural Market Information System, really fits very much in what we do, making that better, digital-based, real-time, etc. So, a number of these things.
Rania, in just a few weeks, as you mentioned, Egypt is hosting COP27, big forum, and we're really looking forward to it. Can you please speak a little more about the main objectives? You did mention 2 messages, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the global action that you hope this forum will inspire. And also, especially when it comes to innovative solutions that are needed for green and resilient development going forward.
I think one of the key points, despite the global backdrop, which is a very challenging one, and it's for all the meetings we're attending, the compounded crises of COVID and prices of fuel, food, etc., sort of weigh a little bit on different messaging. Nonetheless, one very important message is that climate and development should not be seen as separate objectives. They need to come hand in hand. And if there's that realization, we will be able to avail financing for development projects which have climate action at their heart, be it water treatment projects, be it solar or wind farms, so agricultural projects, etc. So it's very important that this notion become more mainstream because private companies, when they're trying to look for places to invest, we also need to make sure that the projects which are presented to them have this synergy and this interlinkages more clear. Finance is going to be very important during COP. Of course, we have the 100 billion, which we can sit down and argue how much we are deviating from it, but we know we're short. In order to move from billions to trillions, or see the trillions that were committed in Glasgow making their way to the projects, we also need to think innovatively of different ways to capitalize on this private sector willingness to come into countries. And so this is another key message. With the debt distress that we're seeing today, with many countries, middle income, emerging, and definitely low income countries, thinking about debt swaps for nature and for climate solutions is important. Even though debt swaps are a bilateral agreement between countries, but the multilateral system can provide different modalities of thinking about projects that could be part of the debt swaps, and research centers can help tremendously on that. We have a very active COP agenda. I invite all participants to go on the website. We have thematic days which tackle gender adaptation, youth coming in very forcefully, and several initiatives related to agriculture and water. And we're putting together the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing to basically also show what different stakeholders need to do in order to push finance from pledges to implementation.
Thank you. Well, before we close our discussion, we have one more question which we received from the audience, from Christina Su in China. Let's take a listen.
With many food support programs underway, what needs to be done to ensure good coordination is in place to avoid fragmentation of aid efforts?
Axel, the question about the aid coordination.
Well, this is one of the big challenges. I would describe often this, there are many good intentions and bad outcomes. That, well, everybody is claiming good coordination, it's often terribly fragmented. And we'll need to be very self-critical, step back and say, what do we ultimately want to achieve? And if we actually keep our minds on that we need to support countries, maybe we can step back and be better coordinated. I think it's very clear that coordination is important, and I would add credibility. There's a lot of talk, and I think it doesn't help country is when promises are made and we cannot deliver on them. There is too much disappointment about this. I think what you are hearing is that in this area of food security, quite frankly, there is no excuse that there is this problem. I think we should also keep in mind that this is a problem where the world community got already together almost 50 years ago, and we said we would solve this problem in 10 years. We're still here. That is, in fact, a scandal and a failure of the international community, a total lack of coordination, a total lack of action. So we can do a lot better. I think we need to concentrate on this, and I think that we need to certainly look when it comes to money. I think we need to avoid that we have 100 funds, but a couple of few, and then a clear results-oriented action. I think many countries know what they have to do, so we need to work with them, put them in the driver's seat, and have a clear program. But most of it is the mindset that we are here together into it, and it requires international solidarity. And what is, I think, missing at this stage is a lack of solidarity with money, and that we have to act on this. And I think that is where we need to push it. There is no excuse that we have this increase of extreme poverty, and this is a stark reminder that we need to keep behind this kind of discussions often the picture of extreme poverty. Why is it that we have still this? And on that we need to act. And I think we can do it. I think the bank is trying to do it through its program. But as I said, we can only do it together.
Thank you. Thank you for all those answers, dear panel members, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you for our guests joining us in the studio. It's time now to pause and hear from young people around the world about how these crises have been discussed. We've been discussing touching their lives in a very dramatic way, about their ideas and the steps that should be taken to develop and build resilience into food and energy systems for their future.
Hi everyone, my name is Joni Panti from the province of Catanduanes, Philippines.
أنا اسمي ياسمين حمدي من مصر.
My name is Seth Ami from Ghana.
Mi nombre es Magali Curiasi Mancía, de nacionalidad peruana, del departamento de Apurímac, provincia de Bancay.
Many families have fallen into starvation and malnutrition because they cannot afford 3 square meals every day.
I have experienced firsthand the challenges for food shortages and energy crisis that are facing the world now.
I can't provide for my family, I can't sustain my family because my salary now has to be directed onto the most immediate basic needs of the family.
Hemos perdido poder adquisitivo. Si antes con 6,000 pesos, poco menos de $2, comprabas 10 huevos, ahora solo podrás comprar 9.
Affordability is one of the largest barriers to a healthy, nutritious diet.
The people of my community are also suffering from frequent power cuts and increase in public transport fares.
Even here in Norway, where I live, we have challenges with rising energy prices and record high electricity bills, food prices, and so on.
We have an ongoing war, a pandemic, and a climate crisis. We have to act now.
Smart farming can reduce hunger in Africa.
لذلك من الضروري العمل على تخطيط ومتابعة التدخلات الغذائية لدى الأطفال.
Boosting productivity, diversifying production, and reducing waste.
Es importante fomentar el racionamiento energético y buscar el desarrollo de fuentes renovables.
L'énergie solaire comme opportunité pour booster l'industrialisation.
Urbanization, pollution-free environment, conserving the energy sources, along with renewable energy sources are a few of the factors that will help in solving this grave problem.
Nous devons interpeller la jeunesse à participer dans le domaine agriculture.
In developing countries like India, on-farm solutions for marginal farmers can help.
Equipping farmers with knowledge and modern techniques on how to take climate action.
There is a need to build forward better.
To deal with this.
For all, today and in the future.
We can only do this together.
Salam, I'm Zarina Nurmukhambetova from Almaty, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Now, people have been sharing their thoughts on this event online and on social media, and now I'm joined by my colleague, Shri Sridhar, who's been following the conversation throughout. So tell us, Shri, what stood out for you?
Thanks, Miriam. Great to see you and to see people in the room here today. We've got a great conversation online, people joining across our different social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, using the hashtag for today's event, which is Food Fuel for All. And they're joining from India, France, Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, and the United States. But what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the devastating consequences of the high food and energy prices, how the world must look for durable and sustainable solutions to protect people from the impact of these crises. So quickly wanted to share with you one comment that we had come in on Twitter from Ide Patrick, who is saying that the impact of high food and fuel prices is seriously creating a hyperinflation. World economists and financial management need to focus on finding lasting solutions. So it's great to see some of this engagement come in across our channels.
Right, and I understand you do have results of the poll.
Yeah, so today's poll, to remind everyone, asked which of these below options do you think contributed most to the global food and energy shocks? And we have 5 options to choose from. They're going to come up here. Is it A, supply chain issues? Is it B, the war in Ukraine? C, extreme weather events? D, exchange rate volatility? Or E, is it all of the above? So before I reveal the results, Miriam, what is your vote here?
I would go with E, all of the above.
I always like an all of the above answer as well. But let's see the results. And as they're coming in, just sharing, we had nearly 800 people take part in the poll today. So we have 8% of people going with supply chain issues, 23% the war in Ukraine, 7% extreme weather events, 3% exchange rate volatility, and 59% do seem to agree with us or going for all of the above here today.
Thank you so much. So all of the above. Okay, I was right.
You are. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Redon from Dhaka, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meeting.
We are nearly at the end of this event on human cost of food and fuel crisis. Let's recap on the main lessons that we've learned. Global shocks to food and energy systems are destabilizing the world economy and pushing growing numbers of people into poverty, reversing hard-won development gains and placing extreme pressure on developing nations. Policy should focus on building international consensus to avoid export restriction that increase food and energy prices, protecting vulnerable communities and promoting investments and innovation to build resilient, efficient and inclusive food and energy systems. The necessary focus on emergency interventions should not divert policymakers from long-term objectives. A transition to clean energy and resilient food systems is vital to protect people and the planet. We hope you've enjoyed being with us today. We really wanted to bring you into these discussions about urgent, comprehensive and streamlined measures solutions to address the food and energy crisis. There is still plenty to come at these annual meetings. Join us tomorrow to learn how investing in education is key to a resilient recovery and for a ministerial discussion on meeting Ukraine's financing needs. And on Thursday, there will be another high-level discussion on financing climate action. You can also watch back this session as well as previous one on promoting inclusive growth and a kickoff event featuring the leaders of the World Bank Group and IMF on addressing multiple crises. You will find them at live.worldbank.org. And if you have any comments on this or any other event at these annual meetings, you can share them with us using #ResilientFuture. To everyone here at the headquarters of the World Bank Group in DC and everyone watching us online, thank you for being with us today. Goodbye for now.